when we have more assurance that in those inflation pressures are easing and inflation is clearly headed back to 2% inflation, we can have that discussion about cutting interest rates. But right now, monetary policy is working, and we need to let it keep working. We can't put it on a calendar. That would, what we need to see how inflation evolves.
Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem there today, not ruling out further interest rate hikes to bring down inflation and warning members of Parliament at committee that if real public spending at all levels of government increases significantly above 2%, it would be difficult to bring inflation in this country down to 2%, which is the bank's target rate. What kind of challenge does this pose for both the federal and provincial governments in this country? Let's bring back the front bench to talk about that. Christy Clark, Tory and Tom Mulcair. Christy, we've talked about this, like how governments are navigating the cost of living crisis multiple times. And often everyone said, well, if the economy got better for a sustained amount of time, let's say in the federal government's case, that could potentially work to their benefit. It's difficult to make that prediction now. It just seems like there's so much stuff up in the air.
Yes, it's true. The federal government is doing two things, I think, that are not working. The first one is they're continuing to spend way more money. So they're pumping way more money into the economy, which is driving inflation. And the second thing that they're doing, and provinces across, I mean, not all the provinces, but British Columbia and some of the other ones, are bringing in legislation that are almost seem deliberately designed to suppress economic growth. So through the regulatory and the tax system, we're really seeing a slowdown in investment in the country, job creation in the country. And between those two things, Canada is finding itself kind of odd man out in the world in terms of slower growth rates than almost anybody in the OECD, and a growing gap in the standard of living for people that we haven't seen in Canada in 40, 50 years. So they've got a real problem ahead of them. And what I worry about most of all is healthcare, because that healthcare needs more support and more money. If the federal government can't grow their spending any more than 2%, and they're not also growing the economy, then I don't know how we're going to be able to save our ailing healthcare system.
It also sort of becomes politically problematic in the lead up to an election, Tom, and for a couple of reasons. Overall, actually, the data we got this week on GDP in the last quarter of the year, that sort of, if you spread it out to the whole year last year, was higher than even the bank expected. It's when you break it down per capita that it's a pretty, it's not a great picture for Canada, which in real terms means that's why things don't feel good for people here, right? Even if our economy overall is doing okay, relatively speaking, per capita, individually, we're not feeling that.
Yeah, and that's Trudeau's main argument. He always says, well, compare Canada to a lot of our, our colleagues in the G20, and you'll see we're doing quite well. But Tiff Macklem was very careful with what he was saying, but it's an important thing to understand. He's saying if we go well above 2% increase in all public spending, then there's no way to start lowering interest rates. But what's been happening is, whether it's in Ontario with the teachers or the big federal settlement after the strike, or Quebec's massive public union strikes and the large settlements that have just been agreed to, that's a key component, of course, of government spending in each of those levels of government. And we're way beyond the 2%. So he's just trying to give fair warning that with what we already know, we're not going to be able to start lowering interest rates because we're not going to get to the 2%. And it's a problem because it's the workers who, of course, the most organized, the ones who are fortunate enough to be in a trade union. We're going to be able to push for those types of settlements. In the meantime, there'll be very small increases, for example, to the minimum wage. Workers who are not unionized are going to be falling behind. And then the catch-up game starts to begin again, and that is another driver that forces up inflation. So it's a very tough situation. I think Macklem did very well. He doesn't have the sparkle of some of his predecessors, but he's certainly very good with the numbers and good at explaining it.
I think also, even if you look ahead to spring budgets, for example, at the federal level, John, and at the provincial level, I can't envision a world in which the increase to spending is, limited to 2%. But at the same time, it packs a political punch if he doesn't start cutting rates as well for people, 2 million Canadians who face mortgage renewals in the next 2 years.
And those are the dots that have to be connected. By the way, I want to really endorse what Christy said about jobs and investment and the fact that we're not focusing on growing the economy. And I think we should discuss that another day because it's a serious challenge for us. But the dots that have to be connected in people's minds, and the Bank of Canada governor can only do so much appearing in front of committees, and he can only be on TV so much. But people do have to understand what he said was true. And he's got no axe to grind. He is not a politician. He's saying, look, if you spend a lot more money, if governments do, then the interest rates are going to stay high, and you, the people, are going to suffer for that because it's your mortgages that are being renewed and your loans and everything else. And I just think that he's telling the truth to people, and I hope they're listening, because in the end, and the other thing that Tom didn't mention in his list of different factors was one more, and I say this in a totally nonpartisan way. I'm not a partisan. It's minority government. Of course, minority government at the national level means that whereas a majority government might, and there's no guarantee with this one or any other one that they would, but they might say we're going to have to constrain spending now because we understand this is going to keep interest rates high and inflation high if we don't. Whereas I don't think that option really exists because of the pressures that are on the current government to spend and to introduce new programs. They could slow those things down, and they should. These budgets that come from provinces and the feds this spring should be ones that say, we don't have any new promises to make for you whatsoever. We're even going to slow down some of the ones we have, and we're going to stay the course because we want inflation to be wrestled to the ground.
I take John's point, Christy, that especially in the federal context, I mean, look who's keeping the Liberals in power right now. It's a party to the left of them who is advocating for some programs like dental care, for example, which comes at a cost. Obviously, there's a benefit too, but it does come at a cost. A lot of people recently have reminded me of during the 90s, for example, when there was a lot of restraint, the degree to which the politicians then faced the public head on and said, here's what we are up against. You need to understand it, and this is why we're doing what we're doing. Do you think that kind of messaging at this point in time could work in the same way?
Well, I think it could if they would have the courage to do it. I mean, when Chrétien and Martin were doing it, what they did is they said, look, we have to look after the bank. We have to make sure that we have enough money first and repair the economy before we can go out there and start looking after the people and doing all the things that we want to do and the big promises and things like childcare and all that. They understood that the fundamentals were important. The thing about this government, this coalition government federally, is I don't think they know where money comes from. Money comes from economic growth that starts in the private sector and employs people and creates tax dollars. That's where government money comes from in order to spend. So they either need to figure out how they're not going to spend money, or they need to figure out how they're going to change the regulatory and tax environment so we can start creating jobs again in Canada and start creating economic growth. Probably they'll have to end up doing both, but I just think, most of them are just interested in trying to figure out how they're going to get reelected. The long-term plans, I think, are that whole long-term planning process doesn't happen in Ottawa much these days.
Just have 30 seconds left. Last word to you, Tom. I think the federal government, if they listen, would counter by saying, we think the investment in the new economy of the future, the green economy of the future, those big battery subsidies, for example, those big plants that are coming to Canada, that's where they see the future of economic growth. What do you think about that?
That's a fair argument, and they're certainly going to make it. But it's hard to explain how we've had this massive explosion in the size of the public service that has little to do with the new economy. It has everything to do with weak management and the ability to do things prudently and add when necessary, but not have this increase, which has not been seen in Canada in over 40 years. So that is part of the problem. That's exactly, in my view, what Tiff Macklem was referring to. She's saying, Be careful, you're overspending, and it's going to increase inflation.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Great discussion. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time tonight. Our front bench, Christy Clark, Tom Mulcair, and John Tory. Our takeaway is coming up next. Stay right there.